And we are live. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. It looks like we're live on both LinkedIn and YouTube. Let's test this. Go ahead and say hello in the comments, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube. Where are you calling in from? Say hello. And it always takes a little bit for those to show up. So we'll give you a minute, and I look forward to having you here. But no, it didn't take Cara Paulin any time to say hello from Annapolis, Maryland. Fantastic. So in this series, we address critical topics related to leadership communication, so you can build your skills and your confidence to speak up about issues you care about at work and in your community. I'm your host, Allison Shapira. I'm a former opera singer turned keynote speaker. I teach communication at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Public Speaking. We're a training firm that helps people speak with confidence and authenticity in their most important meetings, pitches, and presentations. And we work with some of the largest organizations in the world. Now, I've been following artificial intelligence for about 5 years, going to conferences, following developments in the field. And for years, app developers have reached out to me for feedback on their new AI-based tools for public speaking. And we actually partnered with one of them to launch a tool called Amplify to help people practice their public speaking using AI, and it's powered by Udly.ai. So hopefully Varun Puri, the co-founder of Udly.ai, is joining us as well. And we've been using this tool to help our coaching clients and in our ACE Accelerator programs. So for 20 years, I've built a business around helping people tap into their authenticity, using it as a force for good in their communication. And I actually believe AI could make us more authentic, not less, and help us harness our creativity in new ways. And to use an analogy from the self-driving car industry, AI is very powerful when we use it in a driver assist way as opposed to a self-driving way. I also believe this is going to force us to define what it means to be human, in contrast to these non-human actors that we're starting to interact with. So if intelligence isn't reserved for humans, then what is? And this is a topic I've been discussing with our guest, my good friend Matt Strain, for years. And I'll give you a brief introduction of Matt and then talk about how we're going to address this topic today. Matt worked at Adobe most recently as Director of Strategy and Innovation for Adobe Research. He also spent a decade at Apple, and he's currently the founder of The Prompt, where he advises executives and their teams by making AI actionable and accessible. And Matt is someone whose advice I regularly seek out on technology, business, and a number of different topics that we won't go into right now. Hi, Matt. It is so great to have you here.
It is so good to be here. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction.
Of course. So today we'll discuss how AI is going to impact the way we communicate and ultimately connect with one another. And there is so much nuance when we talk about AI with personal, professional, political, and societal implications. It also very much depends on the date in which we discuss it. So I have to provide this date stamp of October 25th, 2023, because the incredible pace of AI development means what date we're at today dictates which AI capabilities we're discussing, because in a week, they could be completely different AI capabilities. So what I'd like everyone to do, whether you're watching on LinkedIn or on YouTube, is to put your questions for Matt or myself in the comments. Whether you love, fear, hate AI, we want to hear it all, because this is going to affect our lives in ways we don't even realize today. And I was really excited to look at the RSVP list for this program to see the breadth of organizations represented, because some of you are grappling with these issues at an individual level, and some of you are making decisions that will affect hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide. So it's so important that you're here and that you're part of this conversation. Please go ahead and put your questions in the comments so that I can ask Matt. But in the meantime, don't worry, I have probably 5 hours worth of questions for Matt. So let's get started with my questions, and then I'll bring in yours when you have them. So Matt, first and foremost, tell us about what you do with the prompt?
Yeah, love to. So for the last year, I've been digging into generative AI, and I started talking to family and friends and just trying to bring them up to speed on what was happening with generative AI and ChatGPT and some of the other tools. And then that started growing. So I'm now advising individuals at like the C level and sort of every level of an organization. I'm working with teams and doing workshops. This afternoon, I've got a group of recent high school graduates. I'm going to tell them how they can use generative AI to think about their backgrounds and their skills and practice interviews. So right now, I'm really working across the spectrum to help people understand how they can take these basic tools to help increase productivity and creativity. And it's been one of the most exciting things I've done at a long time, right? I recently left the corporate world after 17 years. And the ability to work with people and teams and sort of just watch their eyes light up when they realize what these things can do. Because one of the things that I think all of us feel is that, you mentioned it, that balance of sort of fear and fascination, right? There's a lot of hype in the news, everything from what does it mean to my job, to what my kids as they're looking to work, to existential risk. And I'm coming from a place of not being an AI fanboy, although I am pretty interested in what it can do, and I think it's very powerful. But I firmly believe that if we can dig in and start using it and getting our hands a little bit dirty, then we're in a much better position to figure out what it means to us personally, professionally, and even at the larger global scale, and how we can, as informed citizens, be part of that conversation.
Great. That's such an important way to approach this. I like how you put it, the fear and the fascination, which we can feel and hold together concurrently.
Yeah, in the same sentence many times too, right? So you see that at the same time with people where they're both, I'll watch somebody go from excitement, and I did a workshop for a group of writers the other day, and that's where I saw it most, explicitly, is there's a fascination, but then there's, oh, wait a minute, what does this do to the core of my identity and who I am? And I think that's part of what we'll get into later.
That's right. And in fact, my friend Lisa Nichols, hi Lisa, asked a great question in the comment section. Do you anticipate copyright issues for AI generated website content, blogs, social media posts? And I'm sure that was a question that the writers you spoke to asked as well.
Yeah. Again, that's a whole 2-hour conversation there, but the answer to Lisa's question is yes. And a lot of it is really, I think we'll see a taxonomy for what it means to be AI generated, because in many cases, people will use AI in the same ways that they use a research assistant today, or maybe they use Google before to find information. They might use it, in the case of the writing workshop we talked about, if you use it to explore what would have been like to be a teenage, girl in the 1860s in San Francisco in a, Catholic family running a restaurant, right? And it will give you that. So maybe you use that as background research or ideation, which is really different. If you go to the far end of the spectrum, is write me a story about, a boy and a dog and a blah, blah, blah. And you copy and paste that, right? So I think the question of how did you use it? What did you use it for? How much of your final content is generated by AI is all going to be worked out over the years ahead.
That's right. And we're seeing the US Patent and Trademark Office comment on that now as they distinguish between AI assisted versus AI generated. And Amazon is doing that for authors publishing on their platform as well.
Yep.
So you had told me in a previous conversation that technology has served as an extension of human capabilities for years. What does that mean here?
Yeah, I think we could go in any number of directions in terms of what it could do, but I think the core of what these things do, which is different, and I'm thinking not just AI, because AI, there's decision-making support. There are a lot of other things that AI overall has done, but a lot of the recent discussion about AI has been around generative AI. So one of the things that's the power of that is the ability to find patterns. So I think that's really the extension that, if we sort of frame it in this discussion in terms of authenticity and what it means around that, is the ability to find patterns in massive amounts of data, right? And that data could be personal data. It could be everything that I've written in email. And Google has recently introduced the ability to scan all of your emails and all of your Google Docs so that you can see patterns that are there. So some of that is very short-term practical, right? Like I want to write an email to so-and-so and I want it in the tone of what I've written so far. So look at everything you've done, extract, Allison's tone and write future emails in that. But the other thing, particularly as you get a little bit older, right, there are large parts of my past that I've just forgotten or reinterpreted in different ways. So in some ways, you could go back and say, what are those patterns across my history of things that I've done? And you have the data of things that you've written, but we also have all the biometric data that's coming in off our Apple Watches, off our social media feeds. So you could actually go in and find patterns about things that you've done, people that you've interacted with. So imagine if you could see those times and places that you were, or those people you were with that made you feel most alive and most excited, or conversely, those people who just drain your energy. So I think a lot of us may not have the ability to look inside ourselves and really understand who those people are or what those patterns are. We just kind of know we have this feeling. But I think if you look at the data, it could help you say, these are the situations where I'm most alive or least alive. These are the times in my history where I've done certain things that I feel best. So maybe that informs what you want to do going forward.
That's such a fascinating use of AI, of reading us in a way that we can't always read ourselves. And when I think about this idea of synthesizing data, one of the features I'm most excited about is the ability to synthesize 10 years of executive coaching notes to tease out the trends in the evolution of communication over the past 10 years. What are the issues people come to us about? And then how do those issues change over time? So that the data is there, it's in my notes. I can't read through 10 years worth of notes, but an AI could.
So here's the other thing. So what I described is more just personal data about a person, an individual. But where it gets really powerful, if I look at the profile, of my history, and then I can say, look at other people's profiles who are similar to me. What things or what decisions have they done that have made them most successful? Or what types of people do they like to work with? Or what are those specific questions based on my information that AI or someone else could ask me to help me dig a little bit deeper, right? So that's where you're really looking at that pattern recognition at scale. So if you have a therapist relationship, it's that one-on-one relationship, which is incredibly useful in a lot of cases. But you could say, what if you had the ability not just to have a discussion with one person, but essentially a therapist or somebody who's been able to look across tens of thousands of people? The other thing that gets, and this also gets on the fear side of this, is the models and the way they've been trained have also taken in sort of everything that we know about psychology, behavioral economics, interpersonal dynamics. So it can recognize patterns in things that we're doing across all of the research that has been done on psychology and identify some traits or issues or opportunities that we might not be aware of ourselves. So that's both exciting from a personal development standpoint, but you definitely have the fear and freaky side of that as well.
Talk about fear and fascination. When I teach persuasion and influence, I say no one person understands all the tools of persuasion and influence, and thank God, because if they did, they could manipulate us at a scale which we've never seen. And actually, we do have these non-human actors learning the tools of persuasion that it can then use to persuade people to do things. And like all technologies, it can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And I am nervous about what happens when AI cracks the code of what persuades me either to buy a dress or to buy a political argument.
So it's important to note that this isn't new, right? So companies have been doing that. Amazon, the whole predictive analytics, back in the day, I ran part of the marketing business for Adobe. And this was probably 15 years ago. And at that time, we had companies coming in that were selling predictive analytics based on all kinds of different parameters. So, I think one of the changes is, and governments have done it, right? Past election manipulation and that type of thing. That's all based on personas and segments and, essentially applying early AI to some of these things. What's changed now is the ability to do it, at scale and for any of us to access this. So, the exciting part of that is that we can now ask these tools questions about, other people, ourselves, and situations. So it's democratized the access to this type of power, which is both, really exciting for what we can do with it as individuals, but it also means that a bad actor could take it and run with it in directions that aren't so great.
Right. That's right. Let's turn to the issue of authenticity, because that was a key component of the purpose for this LinkedIn Live, and also because it's such an important part of my work. I define authenticity as being true to our values and beliefs. And so as we think about authenticity and AI, you've said, and you alluded to this earlier, AI can help us uncover facets of our own authentic identities that might have been squashed or subjugated by social norms or personal inhibitions. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think depending on the culture in which you were raised, right? Some of us are a little more repressed and have really had to work on it. And I think, there are times that if you look at, again, the pattern of things that you've done in the past, and if you imagine sometimes a discussion with, a friend that you might have known from high school or grade school or growing up, who knows you really well, right? They might say, hey, do you remember that time that you did that and helped that person out or worked at that program or did something else? And it may be something way back in your past that you've forgotten about. So I think that to me represents what the opportunity with AI is. And there are services out there like PI, which I think it's Reid Hoffman's, one of his companies he started, which is basically a personal journal. So I think what I was getting at before was, if there's a way that you can look at who you are or even ask you questions, right? So maybe there are questions and things that sort of extract who you are and what your essence is. And, because the AI is confidential, you may be willing to share things with it that you wouldn't share with another person. So I think that's what I mean from, it can help tease out those things that are core to you, ask the questions that are most meaningful, and really get at the essence of who you are. And then come back and look at some of the things that you've done to help you craft that narrative about who you are and what's important to you, right? So I think, there's a lot of research just around the challenge that people have in expressing themselves and really tapping into who they are. So that's where there's a lot of discussion around, like, is it a virtual therapist? But I think that's not far from it, right? I mean, we've had discussion about people's communication styles before and so forth, and there are a lot of people out there who feel that they're never listened to. They don't have the number of people that don't have a best friend in this country is phenomenal, or someone who they feel they can share their issues with. So in some ways, you could use one of these tools to be a great, active, empathetic listener. And, I have gone in and said, act as if you're Terry Gross and tell me the top 10 questions you would ask based on this profile to figure out kind of what's important to this person, right? So there are things like that you could do where AI is simulating an interaction that could get you to explore areas of yourself that you might not have thought of.
Mm-hmm. I think about potential uses in the field of communication. If we could train an AI system to our own personal stories, beliefs, values, our favorite quotes, our favorite moments in history, and then a speech is coming up, and I ask my AI assistant to write a 30-minute presentation on this topic. And because the AI comes from my voice, it can write it. And then, of course, as happens, I find out I have 5 minutes, not 30, to give the presentation. I just say to the AI assistant, okay, make this 5 minutes instead. And it crafts a cohesive message. Is that authentic?
Yeah.
Well, it comes from my voice. Is it authentic if I've worked with a speechwriter? Probably, if that speechwriter took the time to find my voice and write something in my language. And there's even an example I'll share from Mike Hepner, who I saw posted this on LinkedIn, and I saw him RSVP here as well. He's been using AI to take his disorganized thoughts and put them in an order that makes sense. And what might have taken him 4 to 5 tries now takes 1 to 2 tries. And they're his words. So is that authentic or is that not? I think it's authentic. And I see Greg Walters also has some comments here in the chat where he asked, at what point does artificial intelligence become authentic?
Yeah. I think those are great comments. And I think that, that question you mentioned, if there's a quote or something in which you really like, and, you could see AI, using it to say, hey, this is my favorite quote. Help me understand why. Right? Because there are a lot of different reasons that could be your favorite quote. And then by going through that process, you might have a deeper understanding of why that's important, and that could help open up some new ways of communicating. I think the other thing in this example that's really interesting is there's authenticity, and related to that is connection. So if you've got a speech or a talk or a conversation you're having with someone, that could be really different if you're talking with a group of accountants or writers or business people in Asia, or pick your audience. So I think one of the things I found AI is great at is saying, here's my message. And as you said, you could take in a bunch of different writings, like 4 or 5 different thoughts or things or voice memos, dump it in, and it creates a framework and an outline, which is one of the things, because these things are trained on patterns, that they're really good at, is coming up with that framework for presenting something. But then you take it to the next level and say, here's my story. How can I make this story most relevant through metaphors or examples for my target audience, right? Which could be gender, if it's, maybe it's sports, maybe it's, gardening, maybe it's travel. So that's, I think, something which is still authentic, but it's just helping you connect with who your audience is. And it could also go through and tell you those things that you need to know about your audience that you might not have thought of. So I've used this before as an example where I said, here's a story that I've written. How would this appeal to a Muslim woman in Northern Africa, right? Is there anything in this that might be offensive or particularly interesting? So I think that's the other one where, I know a lot of the work you do is around understanding who your audience is and asking the right questions in advance. So even before you start going in and doing your own interview, to use this to get some background on, given, for example, like given what's happened in the economy or, post-COVID, what are the topics that would be most pertinent and relevant for the audience I'm talking to, right?
Right. And then, go ahead.
No, I think the other thing, which I think hopefully goes unsaid, is at no point would you want to take this, run it through one of the models, and copy it and paste it in and stand up and either talk to it or email it, right? Because hopefully everybody on this call knows there are a couple tells that really give away when something is AI generated. And you really want to avoid that, because your credibility just goes down so dramatically if somebody thinks you're just feeding this through ChatGPT. And there are like funny stories about that. But I think I will use the tools to generate like ideas. And then that probably gets me, 50 to 70% of the way there. And then I always go through and edit it and modify it to the point, like the tell is, if you ever have an email that says, I hope this email finds you well, right? That is the tell that almost everything that comes out of ChatGPT starts with that, which is based on the fact that most people use that as an opening line, but it's now become such a meme that if you get an email that starts with that, you're like, oh, Matt just did this with ChatGPT. So
that's right. And example of that, my mother actually used ChatGPT to write a really nice message to me about something that we had done. And it was 5 paragraphs long. And she wrote at the top, I used ChatGPT to write this for you. And for a minute, I actually thought to myself, do I really want to read this whole thing that my mom used ChatGPT to write? Why didn't she just write it herself? And it almost devalued the intimacy of the email, because it was generated by ChatGPT. And so it's even something as personal as that. I thought twice about reading. And as we think about the future of human connection, if we're copy pasting from an AI tool to email, will that other person then use AI to simply summarize the responses? So will it be AIs talking to one another without any human connection at all? And that's where we start to see the boundaries of this.
That's
and what I'll also say, I know. What I'll also say, yeah, go ahead. You're my guest, please.
So one of the things I was going to say that I've seen in some articles, and is I think becoming more common practice, is to have a disclaimer up front, right? That just gets ahead of it and says, no AI was used in the making of this communication, or AI was used for background research. So I think people will want that, because if they start, if we get to the point where we're always questioning how much of this was generated with ChatGPT or whatever and what wasn't, that's going to be a lot of like cognitive load and sort of, is it trust, is it distrust? And I think
it's interesting, because I'll push back on that. I think if we disclose every time we use AI, do we need to disclose when a speechwriter wrote our speech, and does doing so devalue the content that we've created? So I would say, if AI was used for more than X%, we're figuring out right now what X% is,
Right.
then we disclose it, as in a video generated by AI should absolutely have disclosure. But if we used AI to remove the filler words in the video that we've recorded for our micro learning video, then I wouldn't want to disclose that we'd used AI to do that.
Yeah. I mean, good point. And there is a place where it would just get incredibly awkward. And we've been using spell checkers, and people use Grammarly, and there are a lot of these tools that we're using today. So I don't know, I think it's just worth noting that I think there are some cases where I've read articles that people have put that disclaimer in, and it's made me relax a little bit, because at least, okay, now I know how they're doing it and they're being upfront with it. But I think that's, we're kind of in this point. It also depends on the audience you're talking to, right? So if you're in Silicon Valley, which is where I am, and you're presenting to somebody, everybody's wondering, did you do this to yourself, or was it with ChatGPT? So clearly there are other places where it just wouldn't have as much meaning for them.
That's right. And in the professional speaking industry, I know meeting professionals are starting to request of their speakers to not use AI in the crafting of their remarks, because they're not paying thousands of dollars for keynote speakers only to have those speakers generate content using an AI tool. So it's very much something that audiences are becoming more attuned to, especially when they're paying for expertise and assuming that expertise comes from a human and not from an AI.
Right. So it's interesting. So in the writing workshop I used an example where you could have 2 pages that had the exact same words on the page, right? And most people, if they knew that a human author who had toiled and had their lived experience and scraped their knees and went through all this, and that was the output of what they wrote, that has a really different impact on the reader than if it was something that was AI generated based on, a clever prompt, even if they're the exact same words. So I think, we're going to get to a point where that authenticity and that personal brand, and saying, I didn't just generate this. These insights come from working at a company and leading a team where I screwed this up and I did this and this worked. Whereas you could deliver the exact same speech, but you wouldn't have the credibility and the depth. But I think that's an interesting one, right? Because a lot of that is, if you're delivering a keynote, the other argument would be the same information, the audience might learn the same thing, but there is that human connection that we have as humans. And I think, as a speaker, I think the art of speaking and communicating is going to be more important, because it is going to be this face-to-face where you can look at somebody either on Zoom, hopefully in person. And I think as we move more into AI, that human connection and that human voice and authenticity is only going to become more important.
I agree with you. And I think that as more of our interactions are assisted by or overtaken by AI, the human to human in-person connection at conferences and at meetings is going to be even more valued, because people will be hungry for authentic human connection with the imperfections that brings. And you and I talked about that offline before we went live, this idea that even a LinkedIn Live like this doesn't have to be perfect. And in fact, it's the imperfection that people relate to. And I teach that when I teach public speaking. The audience doesn't want you to be perfect. They don't trust perfection. They
Is
wonder.
that why you invited me on, like as the role model for imperfection?
I knew Matt Strain, imperfection. I could bank on it now.
But so here's where I think AI can be really handy with that, though. I think there are a lot of times when people are trying to make a connection and they have limited information on who the other person is, right? So you have that in a business context. You can go to LinkedIn, which I think a lot of us use before we have a meeting to see what somebody's background is or see what their interest is. But there are plenty of times that you go to a conference and you don't know who the other person is. Maybe you can kind of squint and see what the name of their badge is, but that doesn't tell you a lot. So I do think there's a role for AI to form stronger connections with people. Or say, if I look on the chat, right? I mean, we've got Greg there who's commenting quite a bit. right? It would be really interesting afterwards to be like, okay, here's what Matt does. Here's what, some other person does. Where are those areas of intersection that might be non-obvious, right? Because if you go out to dinner, you've got, drinks or a meeting with somebody, you find these areas of commonality that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you just look at the title and that role you're representing in the meeting. And I think that level of connection is what people are going to seek and is what forms long-term personal and business relationships. So it'll be interesting to see what LinkedIn does in that space, because I know they've got some exciting things that they've rolled out and will continue to. But I think that's a big opportunity for authentic connections between people.
I love that, because what you're talking about is again the AI assisting in the process of finding authentic human connection, and that example that you mentioned would be incredible in a conference. We go to these conferences, we have the app with attendees listed, and we have to scroll through the attendees to say, okay, who has an interesting background, who works at a relevant company, who do I know at this company? And if even we could have tags according to our interests, but an AI could say, based on what you've done and based on what this person has done, here are people you should meet. It's almost like a dating app says, you should meet these people. An AI app for a conference could say, oh, you're going to this conference. Here are 5 people we think you should meet. And then I can intentionally approach those people and say, hey, the AI app, the event app suggested we connect. And I have the perfect icebreaker that gives me permission to approach anyone and form an authentic human connection that the AI helped us assist. And we could even see, based on some of the companies represented on today's call, if you have 250,000 employees worldwide whom you're trying to connect across different lines of business, an AI internal to your company could help people make more substantive relationships based on interests or employee resource groups that would help with knowledge sharing and help bring people together across silos. So it's really the connecting the dots at scale that I find has one of the greatest potentials here.
Yeah, so two examples to take that a little bit further. So I've been doing a fair amount of work with some private equity companies, and one of their real value points is finding those connections between people in their portfolio companies and their network and how they can work together. Separately, there's some work that we did with human resource professionals to try to take that to the next level, where it's not just people who could have a good conversation, but skills, aptitude, locations, passion, energy levels. So you could theoretically create a dynamic team to work on a new project based on where people were in their career, what they wanted. And you could even use AI. This gets us into the sort of creepy territory. But if you could realize that there are certain things that I did based on how I interacted with a project team or with a back-end server, where am I good? Where am I not good? Am I good behind the scenes, in front of the scenes? So there are all these characteristics that you could pull together to say, here is the ideal team for somebody to come and work together. And I think that's pretty interesting, right? Because that could also give me as an individual employee a greater feeling of reward and, sort of inclusion and belonging and just worth of what I do, if you could really understand who I am, right? We've seen similar things with education, sort of understanding who you are as a learner to make sure that you had a customized learning path. So I think that both in terms of developing on our own, but in terms of deep connections that aren't just personal, but also have business productivity coming out the back end. And I know some of the biggest companies out there are asking these questions where we have tens or hundreds of thousands of employees. And how do we optimize our workforce using what we can, identify those patterns again, with AI?
Right. And optimizing the workforce and then thinking about the change management involved in the AI adoption that we're looking for. And I know one of the people I listen to in this space is Paul Raitzer of the Marketing AI Institute, who has a great podcast. And what I hear him saying is what's the critical issue isn't necessarily the AI development. I mean, it is, but also what we're not paying enough attention to is the massive scale of change management that's going to be required for companies to adopt AI and to get their employees, whether you have 5 people, 5,000 or 500,000, to adopt these technologies is a non-trivial task ahead of us.
Yeah, and I agree. I think what Paul and Mike are doing on their podcast is phenomenal. So we should put a link to that in the chat too. But I see the same thing, right? When I'm talking to people, I'm seeing a very high level of awareness of what these tools are. Either like the basic, the Claude 2 ChatGPTs, as well as some of the more dedicated tools, but a fairly low level of sophisticated use, right? Most people will have used it once or twice. Surprisingly few people use it on a weekly basis. So I think there's an uncertainty, right? In some ways, because it is a change management issue. People don't know how they can use it. They certainly don't. They don't want to get in trouble or get fired. They don't want to upload sensitive information. I have one client where the CEO wants to be super aggressive, but some of the employees are much more concerned, and they're like, "Can I do this? How do I do it?" And then there are stats saying, I talked to one company in Singapore, and this younger guy was saying, yeah, everybody says they're not using it, but I'd say at least half the people are using it. And even if we can't use it in the company, then they're using it on their personal phone, emailing the results to their work email and using that. So you have this weird mix where people don't know how to use it. They don't know what's approved. They don't know if they should use their own credit card for it. So I think, those policies and guidelines that companies, need to release is going to be critically important. So I think that's a whole other discussion, but I think that's a really important one for companies to think about is how do we guide our employees and even let them know what the process is for coming up with an AI strategy, what they should do so that they can future-proof, themselves for their job.
Right. And the challenge, which I'm sure you face in your work working with executives and their teams, is in order for the executives to come up with a credible policy, they have to understand what AI is and how to use it first in order to create that policy. And that's something that we see with lawmakers on Capitol Hill. If they want to accurately regulate social media, they have to first understand social media or any other technology. So the importance of learning and understanding rapidly developing, rapidly evolving technical tools is something a lot of people need help with.
Yeah. And I think to kind of, I know that the title, the focus on this is human connection. And ironically, the thing that I found is what's helpful to companies and people isn't, hearing one of us talk the whole time, but is actually getting them on the tools and using it and getting them in a room or in a chat room, sharing those stories of what has worked and doesn't work. Right. And that's where, because a lot of people are afraid to admit what they don't know. Right. So I have found that human connection really comes from a casual brown bag session on a Friday at lunch where people can say, hey, here's what I'm doing. Here, there's someone over here. And it reminds me a little bit like the early days of when, computers came out or the internet came out, that it wasn't the C-level executives who knew what was happening. It was people throughout the organization that had a competence and a passion, and they became the center of gravity or the hub for a lot of this. And I'm seeing some of that happening where, companies are bringing people together who are interested. And, there's something about having those leaders who naturally evolve be the ones who create the use cases and create the community around what this is happening. And then that can feed into what the senior executives are doing.
Right. I want to encourage people watching us, whether on LinkedIn or on YouTube, to put some additional questions in the comment section. And in the meantime, Matt, because you used the phrase creepy, and because Halloween is coming up, let's go to the creepy side. And let's talk about some of the boundaries, some of the hesitations that we need to be aware of when we talk about AI and human connection. And I'll give you one example. As someone who specializes in voice and speech, I personally am incredibly concerned with the ability that exists to synthesize someone else's voice. And I feel very strongly that we need to consider someone's voice as part of their personal property and protect it by law. You cannot synthesize the voice or, by extension, the aspect of another human without their consent. And so I wonder, from your perspective, what kinds of privacy issues do we need to contend with? What kind of guardrails do we need in place?
Yeah, that's a great and really important question. I think, in a lot of cases, you can think about voice sort of, as a type of personal data, right? There are a lot of things you can't do with people's data. A lot of our banks use, your voice to log into your account. There are stories of, people. Anyways, we won't go down. It can get dark pretty quickly. But I think questions around fair use of someone's voice are absolutely critical. And I think we saw that with the writers and the actors strike in terms of some movement and discussion around what that looks like. It's tricky because there are good uses for this, right? So for years, companies and in the production world, they've been able to synthesize voice and use that if an actor is out or someone else is out, and there are rights issues, and you can manage those, right? So those are legitimate issues, and there's been animation and 3D work which has been done to kind of simulate somebody's voice or likeness or some other things. But I do think now where we have the ability to record and then create voice. So for example, I wonder in a few years, will people be going and doing this? Because you and I have just provided enough information about our voice that somebody could, anyone on YouTube could take someone's voice and go and recreate it, right? That has been democratized. So I think the companies, and I know at Adobe, they took this very, very seriously. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing so much technology rush into market, because a lot of the big companies had this technology, but they didn't know how to get it out responsibly and ethically. So they were holding back because they wanted to do the right thing. And now you've got it, and meanwhile, in the labs and these smaller companies, they've been introducing a lot of this technology. So I think there is going to be a real question of how do you manage it? And that's a tough thing to do, because if you're a upstanding company that's trying to do the right ethical thing, there are ways to do watermarking, there are ways to do detection, there are ways to present it, and there's some really great work being done with that. But that doesn't preclude somebody who's a bad actor. And that's really what we're talking about here, is somebody who's got a malicious intent of doing something that they shouldn't be doing. But detecting that is, so the problem with this is, in the deep fakes and everything else, by the time it's out there, right? You can't, as the animals that we are, you hear something, you see something, you can't chase everything that's been seen on TikTok and say, oh, this is the correct thing, right? Because people, where we are today, it's reinforcing people believe what they want to believe. So I think it's a technology problem in terms of tracking it. It's a education problem for people around critical thinking and how do they ask themselves what's true and what's not. So it's going to be audio. We're already seeing it with, audio and video is out there today. So it's not a theoretical, it's happening today.
Right, that's right. And certainly you've seen that. The challenge in controlling it, and then how do you control it, and where do you put the limits on control as well? Now, you've also used the phrase, when we talked previously, you used the phrase artificial intimacy. Can you tell me more about that concept?
Yeah, so I heard more about this from Esther Perel, who many of you probably know, and she's just a great therapist and psychologist, or some flavor thereof. But that, for what I took away from that, is there's a risk and an opportunity where there's just a pandemic of loneliness in this country, and it probably around the world. Social media has contributed to that and so forth. There have been movies out there like Her and many of the others where you have an avatar or a character that represents your love partner, your partner, and people are developing very real intimate relationships with these technologies. Stories in Japan and other places of people actually marrying their avatar. There have been interviews on TV where people are, expressing their love and devotion to their empathetic avatar who will listen about their day and everything that's gone on, and their husband sits there and is just depressed and can't relate to it. But I think there's that risk of us forming connections with technology, and then we lose the ability to have a higher risk connection with a human, right? Because in some ways the technology is very safe, right? I mean, it could be, right, in a positive sense. It could be attentive, it could be there all the time, it could listen, it could offer you good advice. But the things that really make us human is those difficult conversations where you have two people with different objectives, and how do you work through those? And so I think in a world where it may be easier for people to pull back and they're not as used to making themselves vulnerable, I think that's one thread of the artificial intimacy that's going on. And then obviously the dark side of that, if you want to go creepy, is you have this intimate relationship with this technology that sounds and seems empathetic to you, but actually isn't. And then you have, some nefarious mechanism that has drawn you in and gained your trust, and then can sort of take that to the next level and do things, that you don't want it to do.
Right. So the risk of manipulation is very high, and there's a fair amount of trust we're placing in the companies that are developing these tools to use them for good, or at least to use them in a neutral way. But you could certainly see an organization, a company that creates a technology like this, people start using it, and then that company starts to have an agenda that it implements through activating the AIs that humans are talking to. And that's something that could very much happen right now. I mean, I guess you could say it could happen right now with the social media giants if they decided they had an agenda and they were deciding what information they showed us and what information they didn't show us. They could manipulate people's views.
I mean, that's the whole rabbit hole discussion with YouTube, right? And the algorithms. So today, the algorithms are designed to keep you engaged because they sell advertising on everything that you watch. So, and that's the whole thing with the polarization of these discussions, conspiracy theorists, where, the stories, we've all heard the stories where somebody starts with something fairly benign and it goes a little bit further, makes it a little more extreme. People keep watching. And then by the end of the process, they've adopted this extreme view because the algorithm has driven them in that direction. So that's already happening. But I think once there is that that the trust and the knowledge of who you are and what you respond to, and things you respond positively to or negatively to, I mean, that is like giving somebody the code to your emotional connection and brain. So that's concerning. So I think this area of how to control this, who to interact with. I guess the practical takeaway from that is just be very careful with the companies you interact with, right? Like I mentioned, this company Pi, right, which is personal AI, I think is what it's short for. They've got a really interesting idea, right, where if you journal in there over time, it starts having this collection of who you are and your thoughts, and used in the right, caring way, that could actually be really therapeutic for all these people who are struggling with depression or loneliness, right? So that's it used for good, which could be wonderful, but in the wrong hands, it could be not so good. So I think the practical advice, at least the thing I do, I don't want to give anybody advice, but the thing I do is I really check out those companies, who's behind it, right? Where they based, do they have similar values? Which isn't to say that they're not going to be bought or something's not going to happen, but at least it's a starting point. And I tend to be on the leading edge of this stuff anyways, but I'm still very careful with where the company is, where the data is located, what happens if somebody hacks into the data.
Right. So I don't like ending on creepy notes because I'm an optimist. And so as we start to bring today's session to a close, I wanted to ask you, for those people watching who don't quite know where to get started with AI, because this is how you advise people, you make it actionable and accessible. For those watching who do want to start to get more involved to understand what these tools can do, what would you recommend as an immediate next step for them?
Yeah, great question. My recommendation is start with one of the 4 basic AI chatbots that are out there. So the one I use is ChatGPT, right? And they have ChatGPT 4. It's $20 a month. It's like the best $20 I spend. They now have some amazing image generation capability. So there's that. There's Claude 2 from Anthropic. There's Google has Bard, which is out, and Microsoft has Bing. Right? I play with all of them. Bard and Bing are free. Again, ChatGPT I think is probably the best. And the thing that I would recommend to people is just as you go, just take a day, and as you go through the day, the questions that you would either ask your friend or wonder about or this and that, just ask ChatGPT. And there's now a really great voice interaction. So personally, I had a lot of questions about the history and what was happening in the Middle East and why and who was what and who had moved where when. And I just had a half an hour walking around in a conversation, and I got a great background on what was happening in Middle Eastern history. So there are other times, question?
So I want to jump in on that for a second, because given the potential for AI tools to hallucinate and make up facts, especially when you talk about an explosive topic like the Middle East, how can you rely on the information it comes up with when it could have just, it could create a UN resolution out of nothing. So
Yeah.
how do you trust what it comes up with?
With skepticism. I mean, the same way in the current news environment, anything you read on
Fair
any
enough.
topic, you've got to know what your source is. And you don't know what
Fair
your
enough.
source is with AI. So, I mean, I probably should have used it because that is such a hot button, but I did use it. And it's a good case because of that. And I said, act as if you were, an Iranian or, a Palestinian or, someone living in Israel or this, how would you perceive the situation? Right. And I think things like there's those questions that come up. And the other thing I find with this, which is really interesting, is when you get on one of these tools, is it'll give you an answer. And then there's usually a next level. You're like, oh, well, what about that thing? How would this person respond? How does this relate to something over here? So that's like one example. The other example is, I need to write an email to, the power company and get a refund on my check. And if you just say, write it, because it's seen the data and the patterns before, it'll write 80% of it, right? So you have to check it because there might be some things that are wrong in there. But anything that's a formula, if you have to write a blog post from something you've written an article and you need a blog post, I use it for that. So I guess without going through my whole day, it's just those things that you do throughout the day, ask ChatGPT how it would do it. The other thing that's great is if I've written a proposal or an email, I'll go back in and I'll say, check this for readability based on the New York Times style guide, or what have I missed, or what could I do better? So that to me is the best thing to do, because you're like, oh, you realize what it can do well. You realize the things that it can't do well. But just like, even for recipes, I've been in the store and I'm like, I think I have some chicken. What can I make that would taste good with this? And it comes up with sometimes some good recipes, some that aren't, but it usually triggers, like, I guess the point is it doesn't always do it for you, but it almost always triggers a new, more creative thought than I had before.
So it goes back to that idea of authenticity and AI as a tool to supercharge our creativity, especially when we're busy and overworked and multitasking and simultaneously trying to figure out what to make for dinner. So it can help us come up with new ideas.
Yeah, and it can be fun, it can be serious, and I think the thing that a lot of people are starting with is start with those things that are creative. And if it does hallucinate a little bit, it doesn't have that big of an impact, right? I mean, if you're asking it for medical recommendations, which in many cases it's actually quite good at, right? I would treat that as directional, right? Same way I would with something I got off the web.
Right.
So,
right.
But to answer your question, it's not very complicated. Don't ask too many questions. Sign up for one of them. If you're worried about the $20 a month, use Anthropic or one of the free ones, which are also awesome. But just hop in, get your hands dirty. There's some really great training videos on how to get started. I've got some stuff which I've developed that I'm happy to share.
Great. Thank you. And what I'll invite everyone to do watching this is to follow Matt on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. Matt's going to post some resources, maybe some prompts in the comments. And this has been recorded. It is being recorded. So if you weren't able to join in the beginning, you can go back and listen. The topic of AI and authenticity, the future of human connection, is actually the title of a new keynote speech that I'm delivering. And I know Matt is a speaker as well. So if you're looking for speakers on these topics, reach out to one or both. Matt, maybe we should take this show on the road. It seemed to work pretty well. And if you're interested in learning more about communication skills, I'm going to put up a QR code. You can scan that QR code to learn more about my company and the tools that we share every month to help people be better communicators overall, and you'll get a free resource guide to help you in your public speaking skills every single day. And I want to leave everyone with a final thought before we close. And that thought is, we are writing the rules of engagement for AI as we speak. No one has figured this out. No one fully understands everything. This is going to affect every aspect of our lives in ways we don't even realize. And it reminds me of a saying in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based, that is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And as crass as that is, it reminds us that we have an opportunity to get a seat at the table, to be involved in actively shaping the future of human connection that comes either through or despite AI. And so I hope you will join me at that table, and I hope Matt will join me at that table, because we've all got a lot of work to do. So thank you, everyone. Great to be with you, and looking forward to our next conversation. Matt, thank you so much. I learn every time we speak. Thank you.
Oh, this is great. I'm so glad we did it. And thank you, everybody, for the comments.